Hi there, everyone. Mychal A. Bryan here from the Oracular School of Astrology, and today we are here in honor and in memory of someone who has played an immense role on my astrological as well as my personal life, the late, great Dr. Lee Lehman. Now, today I want to talk a bit about my relationship with Lee. Also, I want to take a look at charts from her book, The Martial Art of Horary Astrology. And in so doing, I also want to encourage you all to go and support what I imagine is now Lee's estate by purchasing this book if you have not done so already, because this book has definitely done so much to shift the landscape of traditional Western astrology, as has Lee herself. I first met Lee Lehman in 2018. I met Lee Lehman when I attended the United Astrology Conference in Chicago, Illinois, and I think it's quite kismet or whatever you say. I think it's quite interesting that I'm here talking about this while we have UAC approaching once more later on this year. And I met Lee when I attended her talk on the planetary hours. Now, before that, I already had a client practice. I had been in consultation for over a decade at that point, but I had never interacted with the larger American astrological community. And I think a part of going to UAC for me was to see what it would be like for me to take myself out of the Caribbean. I wanted to know what my astrological practice looks like, what my spiritual practice looks like at a marketplace like the United Astrology Conference. And in previous years, I hadn't been able to go because I was broke. I was a broke university student and I would see the ads, but it was just impossible for me to go. So in 2018, I was able to attend UAC. And it was a life-changing experience for me in so many ways. And so many people who I'm still close to today, I met at that UAC. And Lee was one of those people who I met there. And I sat down on the floor because in Lee's talk, there was no more sitting space. So you had to sit down on the floor. It was literally like a cult gathering. I sat down on the floor in the front row, and Lee was giving this talk on the planetary hours and how to use the planetary hours for quick and dirty electional astrology. And for those of you who ever knew Lee, you knew that those were amongst her favorite words, quick and dirty. Everything was quick and dirty. So this talk was on quick and dirty electional astrology using the planetary hours. And I thought it was really wonderful. And afterwards, I asked Lee if she'd be willing to mentor me. Also at that time, I definitely wanted to find somebody who could mentor me. And once again, it wasn't because I didn't already have a practice. It's because I didn't know what my practice looked like in the first world. I knew what it looked like in the third world, but I didn't know if the practice that I had built in the Caribbean would stand up to what I thought would be the rigors of working in America. One of the people I reached out to was Rob Hand because I attended his workshop. And he told me, sure, just, call me, send me an email and we'll work together. That never happened. Another person I reached out to, because the word on the street was that she was the best astrologer in town, was Deb Holding. And Deb and I, we've had an interesting exchange over the years, but be it resolved, that also never transpired. Lee, however, was somebody who it was a no-brainer for her. It didn't matter that we were in this room with 150 people and everybody was vying for her attention. She said, sure, if you reach out to me, we can get it done. And that for me was one of the things that really endeared me to her, because I feel, and I've always felt, that as spiritual practitioners or people who are a part of this larger mystic tradition, whether you call it astrology or whether it's tarot or whether it's any form of mysticism or magic, it is our responsibility to bring in and to bring up the next generation of practitioners. And that's something that I've held to be true to this day, which is a part of why I'm still teaching. And it's largely because of Lee's example and examples of other astrologers who I had the opportunity to work with. But I don't think that as astrologers, for people in such a field that the world says shouldn't exist in any event, I don't think that it's any, I don't know, I don't think that any of us should ever take the stance that, no, I'm not going to assist somebody in deepening their practice or in understanding this thing at the level that I understand it. So I really love that about Lee, because she was very open to teaching me and to sharing with me everything that she knew. And that is something that I continued to take forward from her example. And Lee and I started to work together. And we worked together while I was in San Francisco for an extended study trip. I think I was studying hypnotherapy or something. And that's how she and I started to work together. And we just kept on going. And I didn't actually know what I wanted to learn from Lee. I just knew that Lee was this woman who had this large following, and I wanted to be a part of whatever she did to get herself to where she was. And then I said, Lee, you know, if you had to teach somebody from absolute scratch, where would you start? And she said, I'd start teaching Horary Astrology. And I said, okay, if you had to teach somebody who was a little bit above scratch, where would you go? And she said, then I would teach them electional astrology. And I said, okay, if you had to teach somebody who was above that, where would you go? And she said, then and only then would I teach natal astrology. And Lee is the person who I got that sequencing of education from. That first and foremost, we learn Horary Astrology. Then from there, we learn electional astrology. Then from there, we learn natal. And then from there, we learn mundane. And that's a system of education that I've largely replicated within my own astrological teachings. And the only reason why I haven't taught electional astrology earlier is because I think that a lot of students who come to astrology, they want to know how to read birth charts. And so I felt like the horary to natal funnel was just as valid as the horary to electional funnel. But ideally, in an ideal world, we would teach horary astrology, electional astrology, because those two things prepare us for all aspects of natal delineation, and then finally mundane astrology as a final frontier. And so I said, okay, well, if that's where you would start, take me through it. And Lee, being the person who she was, she already had a system set in place. She already had a Horary Astrology certificate program, a Horary Astrology diploma program, an electional astrology diploma program, and a natal astrology diploma program. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what happened to the mundane. I guess at some level she felt as if mundane was less appreciated by people, and so we never actually. We did study mundane astrology together, but never in a way where it fully matriculated into an actual diploma. So, of the things I have from Lee, I have her Horary certificate, her Horary diploma, her electional diploma, and her natal diploma. And that involved a small fortune on my part, and it also involved meeting Lee 3 times a week. And so in the beginning, it started off as this very clear teacher-student sort of relationship. But I think if you meet with anyone 3 times a week for 90 minutes a session, things start to shift and you begin to form a relationship that goes beyond the actual apprenticeship model that you're forming with that person. And that is when my relationship with Lee just completely changed and completely morphed into something greater than just being somebody who was in this transactional relationship with Lee. And I remember the exact day when it happened. I asked her in one of our sessions, I said, Lee, what do you think of this book, Planets in Aspect by Robert Pelletier? I said, what do you think of it? It seems to be a pretty famous book, and, you know, I have it on my bookshelf. It's a little bit overwhelming, but I'd like to know from you, what do you think of this book? And Lee said to me, you know, that was a really cornerstone book back in the 90s. It really helped people understand how to think about aspects, even if they weren't replicating Robert's model. And he was also one of us. Now, up until that point, it had never occurred to me that Lee Lehman was a lesbian. And I think a part of that is because in the, I don't know, I think in the psychology of many gay men, it's very difficult for us to identify that the women around us might actually be lesbians, because as gay men, it's far easier for us to sense out the gay in another man, but it's difficult for us to look at a woman, I think, in general, and really realize that. So I knew that Lee lived with Maggie, but I didn't actually understand what their relationship was. And women just do stuff like that. Women just live together. And so it never occurred to me that when she said he was one of us, that she could possibly be talking about that. So I said, one of us, what? An astrologer? Black? Like what what is this us that you and I have, Lee Lehman, that's obvious to you but isn't obvious to me? And and I said, what do you mean? And she said, he was also gay. And I think that I had this traumatic pause where I didn't really know how to come back from that, because once again, it just didn't register to me. And I think that even as people who, if you're quote unquote out of the closet for a very long time, that admission, even to somebody else who you know is gay, that you yourself are gay, it creates a moment of deep vulnerability, and it brings up within you all sorts of things that you probably had to navigate earlier within your life, and it does a whole thing. So I could tell in that moment that that her saying that to me out loud was a vulnerable piece, and it was also vulnerable for me to receive it, because I realized that it just hadn't occurred to me up until that point. And I don't know how we came back from that. I think she's made some remark like, what did you think Maggie was to me? My sister or something? And I think we kept on rolling. But after that, I really felt a sense of a deepened connection with Lee, because I think that there are some things that occur within the gay experience that are relatively universal. The feeling of either being rejected by your family, or the feeling of not feeling as if you fit into society, and then the feeling of feeling like you have to be in the closet to be respected, and then realizing that eventually that's no longer a thing that you have to do. But since you spent your entire life doing it, you don't actually know how to fully be out in the public. And so there's this whole thing that you go through that I think is pretty common amongst gay people. And it's an unspoken thing. And once it's said, or once you realize that you share that commonality, it changes something, it softens something, it deepens something within the relationship. So that occurred. And Lee and I kept studying together for at least a year and a half after that. And she really helped me to think clearly. I think thinking clearly is one of the greatest gifts that Lee had within herself. And it was definitely one of the greatest gifts that she imparted onto me. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about working with Lee was that she wasn't trying to teach me a technique. She was just trying to teach me how to ask the right questions. So, for example, if Saturn is in Cancer and retrograde and conjunct the South Node, and that represents somebody's money, what might that indicate in life in general? Without taking into consideration the aspects of that Saturn, without taking into consideration anything, what might that represent? And how far can we push that representation? And not only how far can we push what that means, but how can we then stack it? Stack it is another phrase from Lee that she was very famous. I don't know if she just used it with me, but she definitely used it a lot. So 2 phrases from Lee was quick and dirty, because everything was quick and dirty. Mychal, today we're going to have a quick and dirty class because I have to go outside and tend to the garden. So there was quick and dirty, and there was also stack it. Everything was stack it. So once you were on a roll with Lee and she felt as if you were in the vortex and you were doing the Lord's work, she would then say, stack it, which means, okay, you've gotten this far. How can you take it deeper? And she never gave instruction on, on how to take it deeper. She was just like, what else do you see that allows you to deepen what you see, essentially? So that is something I really enjoyed. early on in my working with Lee, I created what I called my Horary Astrology Rubric. And a lot of my students are quite familiar with my idea of a rubric because at Oraculos, we have rubrics for everything. But I'm a person who I need to have things organized in a very specific sort of way. I can't just look at a chart and tell you what I see. I need to know this is what I'm looking at first, this is what I'm looking at second, this is what I'm looking at third. These are the specific steps I'm taking. And so one day after class, I just stayed up the rest of the night and I came up with my Horary Astrology Rubric, which is the exact same Horary Astrology Rubric that I teach today. I came up with my Horary Astrology Rubric and I presented it to Lee the next day on the Wednesday. I think Lee and I met on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays because I was young and restless and wanted to have a social life on Friday. So we met on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays or something like that. And so I showed her this rubric the next day and I said, hey, Lee, this is what I want to follow from now on, because from everything that you're saying, it seems as if these are the things that are happening in every single Horary Astrology consultation. And therefore, I need to make sure I'm doing these things every single time. And I'm saying that because if you've read Lee's book, The Martial Art of Horary Astrology, which once again, I highly encourage you all to purchase because it's a book. It's one of the cornerstone books of Western Horary Astrology for sure. And in saying that, I studied this entire book from start to finish with Lee because that was how we went through the certificate program. And then for the diploma program, she pulled out this whole new manual that you can't even purchase online. She has this spiral bound manual that she sent me in the mail with 100 charts or something, and I had to work through that, and that was how I got the diploma from her. But this book, The Martial Art of Horary Astrology, definitely is one of the cornerstones of traditional Western astrology. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about working with Lee was that as we would go through examples in this book, she'd say something to the effect of, I'd never do that today. And I enjoy that level of clarity and that level of honesty of saying that, hey, I wrote this book almost 30 years ago. There are things within this book that I would never, ever do today based on where I am currently within my practice. And what makes me appreciate that further within my own life is that today I myself am an author. And when I look back on books that I wrote 2 years ago, I'm like, oh, Mychal, if you could do it all over again, you change that paragraph to say something different, or you change that word, or you change that thing. But I have no interest in editing any of the books that I've previously written. So they're out in the world, they're doing their thing. Let them be great. And similarly, Lee was very much of the mindset that this book is already a cult classic. It's out in the world, it's doing its own thing. And I don't really think that she had any intentions of changing this. I do know that while I was studying with her, she always intended to change she wasn't putting out no revised edition. She had no interest in putting out a revised edition for this book in particular. While we were talking, one of the things that she had always spoken about was putting out a revised edition of the Book of Rulerships. And I think that maybe that's already out. I think I saw something that was posted on Facebook a couple of weeks ago that people should be looking forward to having copies of the revised Book of Rulerships at the upcoming AA conference in the UK. But yeah, I don't think that reviewing the martial art of Horary Astrology was ever something on her radar. I could be wrong because people change their minds about things. But while we were studying together, the only thing that was actually on her radar to update was the Book of Rulerships. Anyway, so we went through this entire book together, and there were many, 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 countless instances, probably not countless, but there were many instances as we went through these examples that she said, today I wouldn't do that way. One of the things that's notable about this book, The Martial Art of Horary Astrology, is there isn't a specific rubric within this book. Lee presents the charts, And she goes directly into the heart of saying, these are the things that you should see automatically as far as understanding what the outcome is going to be, which is a wonderful way of presenting information, especially when you're trying to get to the point more quickly. And at the same time, we don't have a step-by-step delineative guide to say, this is what you do first, this is what you do second, this is what you do third. So, you know, take it for what it is, but at the same time, one of the things that's wonderful about this book is that it provides many, many example charts, which is something that we need. As astrologers, we need example charts, but we also need to be able to look over the shoulders of people who've done the work and also feel as if we're looking over the shoulders of people as they do their work so that we can have a context for understanding what was going on in their mind. So that's what this book provides. It gives you a context for what was going on in Lee's mind 30 years ago. It doesn't necessarily give a step-by-step rubric of delineation, but it definitely lets you know, as a horary astrologer, what are the first, second, and third things going on in her brain and how she came to her delineation, which in all fairness, if we look at horary astrology books prior to the publication of the martial art of horary astrology, that was just the standard. If we look at Doris Chase Doan's book on horary astrology, for example, it's laid out in the same way. No clear rubric, step by step, but going directly into what she thought was most relevant. Similarly, there are other books. If you look at Sylvia DeLong's book on horary astrology, it follows the same sort of thing. So I think when I presented my rubric to Lee, it was interesting for her to receive that because she didn't write that, but also it gave us a more clear and organized way how to look at the charts together. And there were some things within that she said, Mychal, I think that you're going a little bit too deeply into this, and I don't think it requires that level of scrutiny. I think that we could get there in a much quicker way. So that was our relationship as far as delineation is concerned. And so I went through this entire book with Lee, The Martial Art of Horary Astrology, and in going through it and in hearing her say, I wouldn't do that way today, or maybe I'd change that this way, or maybe I look at this differently, it also gave me a great appreciation for when I find that happening within myself. And I, in echoing Lee's words, oftentimes say to my own students when we're in classes or workshops, hey, flip to that page. And then when we read the page together, I realize, wow, I wouldn't say that. So here, scribble this in the corner or put this in your marginalia. And I think that word marginalia is also a word that I learned from Lee. And my students can tell you that I say it all the time. Write this in your marginalia. And marginalia is essentially the stuff you write on the side of the page in the white space. And so I've taken up the habit of teaching these classes and workshops in full awareness of the fact that I'm going to tell students to write things in the marginalia that actually should have been written in the book. But in working with Lee, I realized that just buying somebody's book isn't sufficient, because a person can put within their book everything that makes sense within the context of whatever their page limit is, and they can't really go beyond that page limit. And so the other 2,000 pages that's in their brain never actually makes it into the book. And so there's always going to be a disconnect when you're studying with someone who has written a book and you're studying everything primarily from that book versus you having the opportunity to sit with that person and talk with that person about the examples within their book and understand not only what their rationale was then, but also what their rationale is today. And so I'm so grateful for having had that opportunity to study with Lee in this way, to understand how her own process had grown and how her own process had further developed in a way that allowed her to be a more deeper, profound horary astrologer when she and I met than she may have been 30 years prior. And I don't think that it's even a comparison between saying, 30 years later, I'm better than I was before. One would hope that that is the case. And while the structure of this book is the same, and she would follow the same structure, the way in which she approached the material was much deeper, working with her one-on-one than the actual things that got written down within the book itself. So that's it. When I wrote my first book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, I sent an email out to Lee to find out if she would write the foreword for the book, because I valued Lee's opinion, I valued Lee's expertise, but more than anything, I valued Lee's clarity of mind. I think that was the thing that was most special for me, the way in which Lee was able to be a clear thinker. And with working with Lee, I realized that there's a very real connection between thinking clearly and delineating charts clearly. I've often told my students that I haven't honestly seen that many astrologers in the world put themselves in a position for them to read a chart on the spot, for them to read the chart without having any background information about that person. And for me, that's always been a test that I've given anybody who I've studied with or anybody who I've sat with for longer than one session. I always present that person with a chart because I know that I know how to read a chart. And honestly, the way how I read a chart has been the same way I've technically read charts for forever. And so I know what I do when it comes to chart delineation, but I want to see what you do, because ultimately the test of real astrology for me isn't the books that you write or the followers that you have or the podcast that you own or whatever. The test for me of an astrologer is, do you know how to read a chart? And can you read a chart on the spot with no strings attached, without asking me for a whole laundry list of details about that person before you endeavor to read that chart? And Lee Lehman was amongst the very few people, 5 people, if that, 5 people who I can say I've actually actively seen read a chart on the spot. Because many of the charts that Lee read on the spot were charts that I gave to her. And so I would put the chart in the front of Lee and say, Lee, read this chart, please. And she'd say, okay, if I must. And then she'd go into a beautiful, poetic, stunning, deep, profound delineation that blew my socks off. And I don't think that there was a time when it didn't blow my socks off, because these were people who I knew profoundly well. I always gave her the charts of people who I knew very well. And she would read the lives of these people from their charts in a way that was truly remarkable. And that's, for me, is what said to me that this is somebody who you should stick with. This is somebody who you should stick around. And not necessarily because I replicate things that Lee does. If you look at my horary practice today, if you look at my natal practice today, it's very distinctly different from Lee's approach to natal astrology and Lee's approach to horary astrology. But what is the golden lesson that I learned from Lee was concrete, event-based delineation. And while she never said those words to me, concrete event-based delineation, that ultimately became my own motto, that I, Mychal Bryan, practice concrete event-based astrology. And I'm pretty sure that happened, or that languaging happened, after working with Lee. Because what she was able to provide evidence for time and time and time again was that she was somebody who knew how to look at the chart and pull from that chart the concrete events that specifically happened in that person's life that caused that person to be who they are. And that is something that I greatly cherish. And with anybody else who is on my list of top 5 people who I've seen demonstrate that skill, that is the primary takeaway, that these people have the ability to demonstrate concrete, event-based delineation. And that's what I want to replicate in my actual astrology. Not the techniques that person uses, not the languaging that person uses, but do I also have within myself the ability to speak concretely and from an event-based perspective as these people? And Lee Lehman was surely that. Lee Lehman was that from a horary perspective, and Lee Lehman was definitely that from a natal astrology perspective, which is something that I completely value and cherish. She was a wonderful person. You know, she was a great person. And I think that after a while, when she and I hit the second quarter of our relationship together, us meeting became something that was genuinely something that was invigorating for the two of us. And I remember on Monday, I'd say something to Lee and I'd leave her with a challenge, because as you all know, I'm a very challenging, cantankerous person. So on Monday, I'd say something, I'd leave her with a challenge. And then on Wednesday, she'd log into the Zoom room with an entire 10 stack of books on the side of her and be like, okay, Mychal, are you ready? Let's dig in. And so I loved that. I loved that in studying with Lee. On the one hand, it was, yes, I'm studying the works that this woman has written, but we were both collectively going back to the drawing board and studying traditional astrology together, avidly as students, voraciously, arguing, debating with each other, and then coming to conclusions that really left the two of us feeling as if we were in a very solid place at the end of our time together. A couple years later, Wade informed me that she had moved to Portugal, that her and Mike had moved to Portugal, which was something she had hinted towards during the pandemic. She said to me, Mychal, if you know who wins the election again, we're looking at ways to get out of here. And I was like, surely everybody says that. But so said, so done. She definitely moved, and she moved to Portugal. And so I didn't actually know when our paths would cross again, because I had been going to enough astrology conferences to know that she definitely wasn't somebody who showed up to all of them. And so I just didn't know when we would see each other in person. And I felt like what we needed was to see each other in person, just so that if there was anything that time created, or anything that rumors created, or anything, any oddness that life created, I just knew that it would be completely different if we were together, essentially. And we never got that chance. I was looking forward to seeing her this year at the large astrology conference happening in the States later this year, as well as to the annual astrology conference happening in the UK. And it is not happening, or our meeting isn't happening. However, be that as it may, my thoughts and opinions about who Lee was as a person are really still as solid as ever. And there's so much more to tell. One of the stories is that I was supposed to go on an international trip with another older stalwart of American astrology who took a great liking to me. And I was supposed to take this international trip with this person. And I was broke. I didn't have any money to take this trip. I mean, besides the fact that I was funneling a small portion of my life savings into my astrological studies, I just didn't have the money to take this trip. And I knew that this person would be pissed and livid with me. And Lee knew that this person would be pissed and livid with me. And we were both kind of trembling together, even though I was trembling more than her. But we were both like looking at this and being like, wow, Mychal, this really isn't a wise thing for you to do. And so I casted a horary chart about it. And the chart was, should I make this trip? Should I go on this international trip? And the chart clearly said no. And then a couple of days later, the day before I should have bought the plane ticket, because it was the Friday and I should have been on the plane on the Saturday, I casted another horary chart. And that chart also said no. But we always think that things don't say no, and therefore we need another opinion. So I called Lee, and she got on a call with me, and she didn't even charge me for the call. And she got on a call with me, and we both pulled the chart up on Zoom. And she looked at the chart, and she was like, Mychal, where are you even going? like, do you see the chart that I see? Why would you even still think that it's worth going on this trip? And I said to her, because Lee, I'm not really sure if I should piss this person off by not showing up to this thing that this person is very much expecting to see me at. And she said to me, Mychal, the universe has told you no 2 times. And besides the universe telling you no, in the horary chart, the omens that surround your life have also been telling you no. And this idea of looking at omens was always something really important to me within my larger divinational life. But I think it took on a new level of meaning when I worked with Lee, because Lee was a person. And I think as I say this out loud, I realize this idea of omen-based horary astrology is also someplace that she wrote this book from. Because Lee's approach was oftentimes, you don't need to go through a whole rubric. because if it looks like a duck and smells like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. But ultimately, she was the sort of person where if it looks like a no, chances are there's a no. And all we need to do is reverse engineer all the reasons why it's saying no, but we don't necessarily need to labor in this nebulous place of wondering if it's a yes or a no, if it's clearly looking like a no. And so many of the charts in this book kind of follow that same idea of starting with the answer and then reverse engineering all the reasons why that actually is what the answer is. And that was her approach. She was a very practical, very pragmatic person. She was a brilliant person, a brilliant thinker. And I'm not sure, I think that sometimes when we're having the freedom to teach our own thing, we teach in a way that's more embodied or more whatever. So I feel like I got a very embodied, a very rich version of who Lee was, because she was following her own syllabus, she was following her own program, and she was doing things the way how she would have wanted to see them done. However, at the same time, I'm sure that anybody who had the opportunity to learn with Lee, whether they were learning with Lee one-on-one or whether they were learning with Lee within the context of some pre-established curriculum, I'm pretty sure that within all of those spaces, Lee would have been the person who she always is, a person who is rooted in excellence and a person who fundamentally wants to demonstrate that excellence to the world. Okay, that is it about my life and times with the glorious Lee Lehman. And if anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. And we definitely have some more time for us to take a look at least one of the charts within the martial art of Horary Astrology. And I also have Lee's birth chart here as well, because it was in the public domain in the Soul of Fire database. So pretty much everybody had a copy of Lee's birth chart. So I do have that as well, which I think is quite interesting. And yeah, we could do that. Okay. So, John is saying, what a wonderful, heartwarming, delightful in memoriam that brings out your regard, respect, admiration, and affection for your mentor. Most definitely. Most definitely. She is deserving of all of that. I've even heard, who is it? Rob Hand once say that he became a traditional astrologer because of Lee Lehman, which is fascinating. It's a fascinating thing to hear, because when we look at the sort of career and the sort of trajectory that Rob Hand has had in comparison to the sort of career and trajectory that Lee Lehman has had, they can't be compared. From a metrics perspective, from a visual perspective, he is a far more popular, a far more famous astrologer in general than she was. And I think that this is one of the things that, and not necessarily in relation to him or anyone in particular, but I think that this is one of the things that Lee spoke about, especially back in the 90s, regarding this idea that there was a very clear difference between what was possible for male astrologers versus what was possible for female astrologers back in the 90s, essentially. And I don't necessarily know or think that she held any level of regret around anything, but I definitely do get the sense that there were women who were doing quite extraordinary work in their astrology back in the 90s, and they never had the same level of fame or recognition as the men did. And this is something that she shared with me, and I'm sharing it because I don't necessarily think that this was a private opinion that she held, because her opinion on this was an opinion regarding the astrological landscape. And when we spoke, it became very evident that men had a particular trajectory where they would sell out the rooms, they would do all of these things. And the women who were actively doing amazing, extraordinary work didn't have that same level of recognition or acclaim, basically. So I'm saying all of this because I'm pretty sure that I recall Rob Hand saying once that he became a traditional astrologer because of Lee Lehman, that one day Lee Lehman sent him a fax of the essential dignities table because at that time Lee was studying with Olivia Barclay, and she sent him a fax of the essential dignities table, and it completely blew his mind in relation to what traditional astrology could be. And it's as a result of receiving that fax or that scan or that whatever from Lee Lehman that caused him to go down his entire traditional astrology rabbit hole, which I'm not sure how many people know that story or if that's something that's even widely talked about, even though I know that it's something that I would have heard him say in a public lecture. But I don't think that people realize the level of impact Lee has had on traditional astrology, because I think for a lot of people, traditional astrology began with Rob Hand's investigations, and it began with Rob Hand's efforts to unearth this tradition of ancient astrology, when in fact, had it not been for Lee bridging that gap, or had it not been for Lee sharing that piece of information with him, what would Rob Hand's traditional astrology trajectory have been? Now, he may have still have found it. He may have still have come that way eventually, because if things are meant to come to you, they're going to come to you. But I do think that it's significant that she was a catalyst for so much of what I think has later on mushroomed and become the traditional astrological movement, and for so much also of what would later become the Hellenistic astrology movement, even though Lee had her views and opinions on Hellenistic astrology, and particularly the way in which it was taking on the astrological community by storm. So she's had very strong opinions about that as well. But even as I say that, and I think about just the sequencing of things, you know, Rob Hand ultimately became one of the major spearheads of not only medieval astrology, but also Hellenistic astrology. And I think it really goes to the question of, had he not had that interaction with Lee Lehman, where would the Hellenistic astrology movement even be today in general? I'm clearly not saying that he was the only one who was interested in ancient astrology, but just saying that for a lot of people, he was the magnet, he was the nexus, he was the gravitational pull that really laid the foundation and laid the shape of what traditional astrology would become today. So had it not been for Lee, where would the Hellenistic movement be? Where would the medieval movement be? So Lee Lehman is definitely a pillar of the traditional Western astrological movement, even if she was not specifically practicing as a Hellenistic astrologer, because she did not feel the need to practice specifically as a Hellenistic astrologer. She definitely was a spearhead for many of the things that we find ourselves now having exposure to within the context of traditional Western astrology. All right. I am very new to astrology and unqualified, but I'm starting to develop what I call a creative thinking practice based on astrological symbology to suggest alternate use of time. Would you please explain what you loved most about Lee's approach? I have always been a diviner. I've always practiced runes as a system of divination. I've always practiced numerology as a system of divination. I've always practiced I Ching as a system of divination. I've always practiced the Kabbalistic Tarot as a system of divination. I've always been a diviner. And via my Kabbalistic Tarot practice, I've always practiced traditional astrology as a system of divination. So I oftentimes tell people, I never had to go through that that period of crisis of trying to reconcile in my mind modern astrology with traditional astrology, because all of the systems of Western mysticism and divinational practice that I was already practicing were completely rooted on traditional astrology. So I didn't even realize that people thought that Uranus ruled Aquarius until my first UAC, or that people thought that Pluto ruled Scorpio, or that some people thought that Pluto ruled Aries until my first UAC. It never even occurred to me because, for example, the Kabbalistic Tarot and Hermetic Kabbalah as a subject and Hermeticism as a subject, all of these things are rooted on the most traditional forms of astrology. And so I've always practiced all of these things, but I've practiced them in isolation. And Lee was the first person who said to me, and the only person who said to me, Mychal, you should give readings where in the same moment as you are pulling the tarot cards for a person, cast a horary chart, cast a geomancy chart, cast your coins for your I Ching hexagram, do everything, because that is essentially the moment of divination. And she said, from a theoretical perspective, I believe that whatever time is culling and pulling out of that moment should essentially resonate across those various oracles. Mind blown. Absolutely positively mind blown, because I had never thought before about doing the tarot and the astrology and the runes and the I Ching and the geomantic chart at the same time. It just never occurred to me. And Lee is who I got that piece of information from, or that piece of insight from. And I don't even know if that's something that she was doing within her own practice, because Lee was very much a Horary Astrology person and a I Ching person. Those were Lee's oracles of choice. I believe Lee wrote a tiny book on the tarot, or she translated a tiny book on the tarot that was written by Pappus. Pappus is a classical, obscure tarot author, I think probably from the 18th or the 19th century. And I know that Lee translated one of his books on the tarot. It's very small. It's a very small blue book. But I've never known Lee to have a tarot practice per se. And so it was her understanding that astrology is also a magical practice. And I'm not even talking about astrological magic. You know, a lot of people talk about astrological magic as a thing, and that was never Lee's specific orientation. Lee's understanding was that astrology by itself was a magical practice, and that Horary astrology was as much a divinatory practice as the tarot, as the runes, as the I Ching, as any of these other systems of divination. And so even though Horary had a very mechanical aspect to it, what's the mechanical aspect of it? It's this whole thing of, I have to cast this chart and the latitude and the longitude of my location, and I have to take the time and take it to Greenwich Mean Time and then do all of these things. There's a lot of calculations that go on within astrology and a lot of work that goes on into knowing how to cast a chart in the first place. And then after you do that, there's a lot of work that goes into knowing how to read the chart, and there's lots of rules. And so there's a place at which I think it's very easy for us to slip into this form of thinking where we think that Horary astrology is somehow less magical than shuffling a pack of tarot cards and stopping when the spirit moves us and cutting the deck when the spirit moves us and flipping the cards when the spirit moves us. I think that we have this thought within our mind that horary is more of a left brain pursuit, when in fact it is just as technical but also just as magical as anything else. So I think this part of Lee's astrological being was something that was very important to me. And in a lot of ways, Lee was an astrological shaman. And in a lot of ways, Lee was an astrological witch doctor. And in a lot of ways, Lee was an astrological clairvoyant, in a sense. And not that she was actually clairvoyant in any textbook definition of the word, but she knew that the technique of what she was doing was very technically sound. She knew that she was an astrological technician. But beyond that, she also knew that there was a ghost within the machine that I think she tried to be in communication with in the process of her reading charts. And earlier I described this as her having an omen-based approach. But a lot of that omen-based approach goes back towards very ancient systems of divination. Because before we had these very formalized or these very formal systems of divination, we had divination that was very omen-based. Blackbird flies over my shoulder and shits on my head means this. Blackbird flies over my shoulder, and when I look up in the sky, it shits in my eyeball, it means this. Before we had this very clear sense of the ruler of the first house is the significator of the querent, and the ruler of the house that corresponds with the topic of the thing that's being asked about is the significator of the quesited, and the moon is the psychic undercurrent of every horary reading. Before we had this very formal understanding of how to do a formal system and a formal codified system of divination, we were interpreting the guts of animals, the shit of animals, the farts of animals. We were interpreting things that naturally occurred within nature. And so even though we never actually interpreted the excrement of any living being together, working with Lee, there was this sense of there always being a striving for something beyond the astrology. How can we step into the numinous? How can we step into something that goes beyond these planetary glyphs that we see on the page? How can we use that as a launch pad to connect us to something ancient within the zeitgeist, within the collective soul of human beings? How can we use this chart as the launch pad to really tap into something else? And some days it happened and it was very fluid and flowing. And I think we all have that as astrologers. Some days you pick up a chart and you read it and you're completely in that zone. You're tuned in, you're tapped in, you're locked in, you're in that zone. And what's coming out of you is no less than the voice of God. And then other days you can feel that what's coming out of me is my own voice and my own technical expertise, but I don't actually feel like I'm drawing down the lightning from the eternal in the way that I did 2 days ago. And so there were some days with Lee where it felt like we were drawing down the lightning from the eternal, and it left us both in a state of deep, profound pause. And then there were other days when it was just like, okay, let's read these charts. We have an hour and a half to spend together. Let's do some astrology, and I'll see you on Thursday, sort of thing. And that's it. That is what I think is most profound about my working with Lee, this joint ability to step into the throne room of the eternal together and to both be able to know when we were there versus other days when I was just in my bedroom, she was just in her living room, and we were just reading some charts and calculating some numbers and reading some ancient textbooks. And that idea of being able to step into astrology as a magical practice and as a sacred practice is something that I'm trying to replicate more and more within my own life. And I think a part of that is also me being willing to bring in other practices that aren't necessarily just astrology, me being willing to lean back on my Kabbalistic tarot roots, me being willing to lean back on my astrological geomancy roots, me being willing to lean back on my energy healing and on my dream work roots. And those were things that Lee encouraged me not to give up. And stupidly, I gave them up in the name of building the leading school in concrete event-based astrology. That was my goal for many years, that I wanted to be known and I wanted to go down in history as having built the premier school that gave an education in concrete event-based astrology. And fortunately for me, I was the person who made that term up, concrete event-based astrology. So of course, I was the best at doing it because I made it up. But ultimately, this idea of becoming that was more important to me. And in the process, I let go of my energy healing practice. I let go of my Kabbalistic tarot practice. I let go of my geomancy practice. I let go of so many things in pursuit of this goal. And now that I'm in a space where I feel like I am that, I've become that, I am wanting to go back to that piece that Lee said to me, which was, Mychal, you have such a beautiful spiritual practice beneath you. You should find a way to integrate that into what you do as an astrologer. For years, I didn't know what that integration would look like. And honestly, I still don't know what that integration looks like, truthfully. But I know that as I practice more of those other spiritual, mystical practices, it makes my life and my practice as an astrologer feel a lot more fulfilling. I'm actually retiring later on this year, and I'm still going to do all of the writing and stuff that I do, but I'm retiring in the hopes of getting back to that piece. How do I forge a personal practice for myself that allows me to feel like I'm standing in the presence of the eternal? I felt that on more than one occasion working with Lee, not because Lee herself was the eternal, but because there's just something that happens inside of you as an astrologer. And, some people have come to me looking for this. Some people have come to me in a reading saying, oh my God, I've heard how you talk about astrology and it sounds like you've been touched by God. And I want to have a reading with you because I want to have that experience of being touched by God. And I'm like, girl, who's to say that that's going to happen today? But I think for all of us as practitioners of any spiritual practice, at some point, you can feel when you're stepping out of yourself and stepping into something greater. And that's something that I had felt independently for a very long time. And I think it was something very cool for me to experience with Lee, to feel that, wow, the two of us are standing in this vortex together. Wow, I'm getting the tingling on the crown of my head. Are you getting the tingling on the crown of your head, Lee Lehman? Because it feels like there's something going on here that's transcending this black and white chart that we're looking at on the screen. And it feels like we're actually about to pierce the veil, like we're that close. And that feeling is a feeling that I want more of. And I think I realized that I have to step away from the astrology community in the way that I've been involved in the astrology community for like almost a decade now. I have to step away from that community, from this community, in order to really cultivate and pour more energy into those magical practices that Lee told me I shouldn't have let go of in the first place. So that was a long way of answering your question, but I think that is what I would have gotten from Lee that really felt good and like something that I want to keep on holding on to and leaning into. You're very welcome. All right, so here on the screen, we have the birth chart for J. Lee Lehman, born September 9th, 1953 at 4:35 a.m. CST in Wakefield, Nebraska. Now, there is some argument regarding the actual time of birth, because Lee did rectify her birth chart so that she would not have Leo rising, but that she would have Virgo rising. And I know that we took a look at her actual chart at some point in time. Once again, I haven't spoken to her in years, but I know that she and I had a very rousing discussion regarding her actual ascendant degree. Now, we have somebody in the audience who said that what I had said previously was the other way around, that she wasn't arguing that she had the Leo rising, but she was arguing that she had Virgo rising. And now that I'm sitting with it a little bit longer, once again, this is years in the past, I think her argument wasn't that she had Leo or Virgo rising, really, but her argument was that she had Regulus rising. That was actually the main point that she was making, that she had Regulus rising, and that she felt more confident about the Regulus rising with her rectified birth chart than with the unrectified birth chart. Be that as it may, I have her chart on the screen without an ascendant or a midheaven, because the things that I want to look at within her chart are things based on the planetary combinations that we see present here. And first of all, what really stands out for me, especially when you pull up her chart with the houses, is that she technically has the combination of Mars, Pluto, very close to what we believe her ascendant degree to be. Now, for those of you who don't know, Lee Lehman was a martial artist, and in her youth, it was something that she was very much passionate about. And Lee also wrote the book called The Martial Art of Horary Astrology. Mars Pluto is a combination of fighting and fighters. Mars by itself, as we know, is the god of war, and Pluto, from an astrological perspective, or from my astrological perspective, particularly from a medical astrology perspective, abnormally magnifies the intensity of anything it is in connection with. So Mars Pluto within the chart of Lee could represent this abnormal intensification of the desire to be independent, of the desire to be self-motivated, of the desire to be a lone wolf, and essentially of the desire to be her own person. It also magnifies this part of her that is a warrior, and this part of her that is a fighter. And for those of you who know, I think I saw somebody a couple days ago on Facebook, another prominent astrologer, saying that Lee was kind and loyal and astute and adversarial and all of these things. But Lee, and I think a part of it is that Lee, if she had an opinion about something, she let you know what that opinion was. So there was never really this idea that if Lee thought something, that she wouldn't express it to you regardless of how it landed for you. Because I think that there was a part of Lee that fundamentally wanted to tell things like it was, basically. So that's something that we find with the combination of Mars and Pluto. Now, Mars and Pluto is also a combination that is very aware of the fact that if it's going to hurt you, it's going to do so intentionally. It's not going to do it in a way that has some hidden agenda or some ulterior motive. You're going to know that this person means business if this person actually wants to hurt you, or if this person wants to do something that is their response to some slight that they would have received from you, essentially. So Mars Pluto is also having that within its soul and psyche as well. And once again, it's not even from a place of I just want to hurt you, because Mars Pluto is deeply and fiercely protective. And so this could have been, and it could have represented for her, a deep and fierce need and desire to really protect those around her, but also to protect herself. And sometimes people may have experienced that as her putting herself before others or before those people themselves. And other times people could have experienced it as a competitiveness. But regardless of what we experience these things as, it comes from this desire of deeply wanting to preserve one's own self-interest and the self-interest of those who are also relying on this person. So that's what we see with the combination of Mars and Pluto. Now, as we go on within the chart of Lee, we see some other really great combinations. One of the combinations that we see here is also the combination of Moon in a square relationship with Jupiter. Now, from a medical astrology perspective, and even barring medical astrology, from a natal astrology perspective, the moon is always going to be the universal significatrix of women within their own charts. And so here we have the moon in a square relationship with Jupiter. What are things that we know about Jupiter? Jupiter is a god of law. Jupiter is a god of religiosity. Jupiter corresponds with all the things that we do within our lives to expand our human experience so that we can feel as if our lives are liberated beyond the specific strictures of our human experience and that we're actually participating in a wider cosmic world. The glyph of Jupiter is composed of the crescent of spirit being the entry point by which we interact with the cross of matter. What does this mean? This means that a Jupiterian person is fundamentally looking for ways to expand our view and our vision of the world, because independent of an expanded view and vision of the world, all there is for us to see is world. All there is for us to see is the dark, heavy, material reality of the world in which we live. So for the Jupiterian, their primary goal in this lifetime is to create an open portal by which we interact with our idea of this mundane world in a deeper, more philosophical, more spiritually informed way. So as a person, Lee is the embodiment of Jupiter. Lee is and was the embodiment of this idea of opening the world, opening the doorways of our perception in such a way so that we can see the world in a much larger way than we may have previously been conditioned to see it, so that we can challenge the government of matter and material ideologies in such a way so that we can realize that we are so much more than these physical entities that we perceive ourselves as being, but there is actually a ghost in the machine, and all of us, it is all of our birthright to participate in that depth of self-knowledge, in this understanding that we are actually the spirit that informs matter as opposed to the matter that informs spirit. So this is something that we see her being with the Moon-Jupiter combination. Now, as we know, Jupiter is a planet that can sometimes take on more than it can realistically handle. And so this could also indicate a streak within Lee to continuously do and to do and do and do until the doing got done or until she herself was exhausted, because there is this wafting nature of Jupiter that constantly wants to expand and that constantly wants to reintegrate into itself as much of what there is to know about the world and what there is to know beyond the world as possible. So this is something that we oftentimes see within the charts of people who are lifelong learners. And it's also something that we see within the charts of people who just can't stop doing stuff, because fundamentally she's hardwired to live a life of constant doing and constant learning and constant growing, and through that growing, tapping into new spaces of wisdom than what she had before. Which, like I said previously in giving my commentary on her book, The Martial Art of Horary Astrology, Lee often said, if I wanted to do it differently, I would do it differently, but I'm not necessarily inclined to do it differently, because Lee was informed constantly by the new information that she was bringing into herself, and she never got stuck. I think one of the things that is challenging within a lot of older astrologers, especially a lot of older astrologers who've made their name based on doing certain things in a certain way, even when they know that what they're doing is no longer accurate. Because that thing that they're doing has gained so much momentum, it becomes impossible for them to break that momentum to step into something else. And the reality is, as astrologers, we have to be malleable and we have to be able to look at our previous work and say, hey, I would have done that differently. Had I known then what I know now, I would have done that differently. And I'm not afraid to say out loud to you all that this thing should be changed and that you should change it within the context of your studies because I was wrong in what I said initially. Now, coming back to Lee's chart, we see that she has another combination that is very strong and standing out considerably and further bringing out our understanding of this Jupiter. And it is that she has the combination of Mercury in a square relationship with Jupiter. And that is Mercury in a Dexter square relationship with Jupiter. And Mercury-Jupiter is one of the combinations that we find within the charts of teachers, point blank, period. So we can look at this and say that it was Lee's destiny in this lifetime to become a teacher, to become a philosopher, to become somebody who made a living through the communicative work that she did with the world around her, who made wealth through writing. Wealth comes from Jupiter. Mercury governs writing. Who made wealth through speaking. Wealth comes from Jupiter. Mercury governs speaking. Who made some level of a lucrative life for herself through her teachings. Lucrative life coming from Jupiter, Mercury governing teaching. This is one of the quintessential combinations that we look for from a traditional astrological perspective as far as the topic of one being a teacher or thought leader is concerned. Because once again, whereas Mercury-Saturn might indicate I can only teach this one thing and I'm locked into the shape of this one thing that I'm teaching, Mercury-Jupiter says no, but there's a whole world around you that you could also tap into, and that entire world is demanding for us to continue to grow and for us to continue to become wise and for us to continue to deepen our understanding of the tools at our disposal. Now, she was also a Mercury-Saturn person, and this is something that we would never see if we were looking at her chart purely from a zodiacal perspective. But if we look at her chart by declination, we see that Lee is having the combination of Mercury in a contra-parallel relationship with Saturn. She has Mercury at 6 degrees north, 3 minutes, and she has Saturn at 7 degrees south, 33 minutes. And the orb we use for a declination is about 1.5 degrees. So essentially, her Mercury and Saturn is exactly in the furthest distant orb that we would use from a traditional perspective as far as looking at aspects and declination are concerned. Mercury-Saturn is completely tying in with the fact that Lee was very much a traditional astrologer, and Lee was very much somebody who was able to see clearly and see in a very systematic and sequential sort of way. I think what's lovely about Lee's chart is that she isn't just a dogmatic Mercury-Saturn person, but she's also an inquisitive Mercury-Jupiter person, which allows her, even within the context of the structured confines of what she knows to be true, she also has this Mercury-Jupiter, which constantly pushes her to discover more and to learn more and to grow her understanding in even more deeper, more profound ways. Now, finally, I think what is significant here is that Lee also has the combination of Sun-Mercury, or rather Mercury-Sun. And this is significant because within the writings of medieval astrologer Abraham ibn Ezra, we are told that when a person has the conjunction of Mercury and the Sun within their birth chart, it is as if that person has 2 Mercuries within their birth chart. Now, one might argue that Lee Lehman was quite fine with just 1 Mercury, But this idea of being doubly mercurial is quite profound, because in being doubly mercurial, this can indicate that she surely was a thinker. She surely was the embodiment of Mercury. She surely was somebody who set herself up with the task of being an astrological troubleshooter. She was a person who understood her value in the world largely by the information that she had to share with the world. And as a result of that, and as a result of her being mercurial, she also had a mind that had the dexterity necessary to do some of the juggling and the gymnastics that is so important for those of us who are astrologers to actually be able to do. Because there's a very real level at which you can't really do astrology if you do not have the ability to think with a mind that has the ability to exist in multiple places at the same time. It's kind of impossible to do astrology if you're still stuck at 1 + 1 = 2 within your overall thinking and approach to life. And some people make very good astrological students who don't ever become very good astrologers because their mind doesn't have the plasticity necessary to exist within contradiction without being completely torn apart by that contradiction. And when a person is mercurial, that person has the ability to go to the highest height of Mount Olympus, the deepest depths of the ocean, and the deepest pits of the underworld, and still live to tell the tale. And this is a necessary skill for those of us who practice astrology or dream interpretation or any sort of divinatory practice, this ability to think in multiplicity and this ability to exist within the dramatic tension between contradictions and not be completely destroyed by the contradictions that we find, because the astrological process is a process of taking in a world of information and consolidating that information and sifting through that information and being able to rise out of that chaos with something that is sound and salient and that rings the chord of truth within the person who's receiving it. And with Lee being doubly mercurial through the Sun-Mercury combination, triply mercurial through the Mercury-Jupiter combination, and just born for the role of doing this task of expanding the world in which we live by virtue of her philosophy, by being a Moon-Jupiter person, we see that Lee had all of the tools and skills necessary within this life to become exactly who she became, because her chart already declared that it would be so. So that is it for today, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here once again on the Oraculous podcast, particularly for this deep dive into my understanding of the life and legacy of Lee based on my own life with Lee, and also into diving into Lee's chart with me today. I sincerely appreciate all of you for being here. It has been so wonderful to share these things that I haven't spoken about in ages, and to be able to sit down here and share them with you all in a way that has felt honest, in some cases sensitive, but also in a way that I think was respectful of Lee and what she's given me and the time that we've shared together. I'm so very grateful for you participating in this with me. This is not a self-promotion in any way, shape, or form. And so I would like to direct you once again to purchase Lee's book on the topic of Horary Astrology, called The Martial Art of Horary Astrology, because this is definitely where I began my own Horary Astrology pursuits, and everything that I am in life as a Horary astrologer started in my initial studies with Dr. J. Lee Lehman. And I'm so grateful for her for that. And I'm so grateful to send you all to purchase a copy of this book, The Martial Art of Horary Astrology, so that you can have the opportunity to learn from her yourself. I also plan to bring out a series in which I take a look at the charts in Lee's book, The Martial Art of Horary Astrology. Once again, just because I think it's a nice thing to do, and also because I want for more people to just be aware of what her legacy is. So if you want to be a part of that, please make sure that you are a part of our network over here on the Oraculos podcast. Please subscribe to the Oraculos podcast wherever you find us on the internet, so that you can be a part of the magic and the momentum of what we're doing, because a big part of that magic and momentum is going to be rediving into horary astrology, primarily starting with the chart examples in the martial art of horary astrology. So thank you all so much. I love you all so much. And until next time, I'm Mychal A. Bryan, leaving you in peace and love and hope, and saying if there are people in your life who you respect and love and cherish, let them know that today while they're still here. Because why wait? Have a good one, everybody. Bye for now.